Hey folks, I want to continue to look at some verses in First Corinthians with you. I want to stick with chapter 6 and move into verse 18 and talk about sexual immorality. Um, in verse 18, Paul writes, "Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body." So sexual immorality biblically would be defined as any kind of sexual activity that takes place outside the bounds of a marriage covenant between husband and wife. And these would include sins, obviously, such as fornication, which is sex outside of marriage, sexual intercourse outside of marriage. But it's not just the intercourse that would be defined as sexual immorality. God has a much higher standard than that. He expects total purity. So that would include sins such as foreplay. I know a lot of people don't believe Scripture addresses foreplay as sin, but it does if you go back to Ezekiel. Um, they talk about the virgin women having their breasts pressed and how they played the whore. Foreplay outside of marriage is sinful. And it will also include sins, obviously, like homosexuality. Sodomy, too, would be sinful when outside the bounds of marriage. And lust. Jesus said to look upon a woman with lust in your heart is to commit adultery. So lust is a big one. I think that gets most of us at one point in time in our lives uh, because it's so easy to fall into that trap. I think that's the one most people struggle with a lot. And I would say most cases, masturbation is also going to fall into the category of sexual immorality. Um, the scripture doesn't specifically name masturbation as sin, so I would never look at someone and say it's definitely a sin for you. But what I will say is that lust is definitely a sin, and from my experience, I think lust almost always goes hand in hand with masturbation. So that would be something I would avoid. Uh, Ephesians 5:3 in the New International Version says it perfectly. It says, "But among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people." So, when considering whether masturbation is wrong or sinful, consider, is it a hint of sexual immorality? I think in most cases it's going to fit that. Certainly, masturbation can become an idol if you do it too much and it gets between you and God. It's taking your focus off God. Anything that takes your focus off God would be sinful. Um, but yeah, sexual immorality can include the things I've mentioned. And I think one thing I want to talk about that Paul mentions here in 1 Corinthians 6:18 is he separates this sin from all other sins. And I think that's significant to note um, because I believe from my reading of scripture, including this verse, is that sexual sins are a more severe offense to God. Um, and I think that's what he's separating. He's saying every other sin is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. And then you factor in, if you look at the sins that were being committed right before the flood, the last one that was mentioned was sexual immorality. The sons of God having sex with the daughters of men. And then right after that, God decides to flood the earth. I think that's significant. Um, uh, Homosexuality is a sexual sin, and it's one of the few things in Scripture God calls an abomination. The punishment for adultery in the Old Testament was to be put to death. Only a few sins in God. Only a few sins does God say you commit this, you deserve to be put to death. So I think we can gather that sexual immorality is a severe offense against God. And as Christians, we are called to purity. We are called to abstain from sexual immorality. And as Ephesians 5:3 says in the NIV, not even a hint of sexual immorality must be in our lives. He expects purity, that is his standard. And we as believers should strive to uphold that.
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and join and follow us on these platforms.